Yay.
Okay. Good.
All right. All right.
I'm really happy that this is all working, and that we're doing this presentation and webinar. I think there were about 20-something people on the webinar, and then there's also, for those on the webinar, we've got a group of us here in person at the Coastal Conservancy. For those in person, if you need to use the restroom, I'll put the badge over here, and then restrooms are at that end of the building. And we've got chocolate and cookies floating around. But I want to quickly turn it over to Dr. Allison Rose Jefferson, who I first came upon her work when we started at the Coastal Conservancy doing some research about Bruce's Beach for this Government Alliance on Race and Equity program that we're going through this year. And everything I was finding about Bruce's Beach online, everything kept coming back to you and your work and your website. And I just thought, oh, I would really love to meet this woman and find some connections with the Coastal Conservancy. And then through our lower cost overnight accommodation program, Dr. Nina Roberts at San Francisco State University helped us with a couple workshops, and Dr. Roberts did a lot of research about exemplary programs and invited Dr. Jefferson to join us at a workshop in Los Angeles to present on some of her work. So that was a great opportunity to meet her, hear about her work, and followed up and invited her here to present to the Conservancy and our stakeholders. And Dr. Jefferson's a historian and heritage conservation consultant whose research explores the intersection of the history of the African-American experience in Southern California, historical memory, historic heritage conservation, and spatial and social justice. And she has a book in process, Leisure's Race, Power, and Place in Los Angeles and California Dreams in the Jim Crow Era, which we're all going to read. Very excited. So I'm going to turn it over to you. This acts as the mouse, and you can hold it and just scroll through.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I just want to ask a quick question of our audience, and I'm not sure where to stand and hold the so I can just hold it. It doesn't have to be on the table.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. How many of you all know much about Southern California from the standpoint of being on the ground there? Walked around a few times and what have you. And how many of you all are Californians? Okay. All right, just curious, because we have so many transplants that have moved here and they are becoming Californians, but they're not quite yet. So I come to this as a historian, but I'm a public historian. And what that means is that I do programs that are outside of the academy, outside of higher education as a historian. I'm interested in doing history that reaches out to various communities, and that's how I got involved in the history and the sites that I'm going to share with you all today. Because I started out in heritage conservation, and then I decided that I wanted to expand what I was doing, and so that's why I went and got a PhD. And these are, I'm going to give you a little bit about the history, about the memory, and then of these sites, and about some programming that I've been working on to engage people in the history intersecting with watershed stewardship and recreation. So African Americans began moving in larger numbers to the Los Angeles environs in the decades surrounding the surrounding the turn of the 20th century, joining communities of whites and Jews and Chinese, Japanese, old Californios, and New Mexican immigrants, as well as immigrants of various other national backgrounds. The majority of new Black migrants relocated from American southern states. Like those who moved to the northeastern parts of the United States, African Americans moving to California and other western parts also acted to escape the worst of Jim Crow era restrictions. That's not, oh, it's a roll thing. Sorry, I've got to get my, it doesn't click?
No, I don't think so. You can, I think you can use the arrows on here too, if that's easier. Yeah.
I'm all the way.
Yeah, you can, if you want, you can just press
Can we
these
get back
arrows.
to the beginning?
Oh, yeah,
You're familiar with this, and I'm,
yeah.
okay.
Wait a second, I'm going the wrong way.
Well, either way, so.
Towards you is forward.
Yeah,
Oh,
wait,
now
is this?
That is the
Oh,
beginning. That's where I
yay.
want to be. Now,
Okay,
just wait.
I think just use this.
Okay.
Yeah, press that arrow when you want to go.
Okay, thank you. To those of you on the phone, sorry about this little technology glitch. Okay. So, African Americans, similarly to others who moved to the state, embraced the booster promoted California dream of a leisure lifestyle in picturesque outdoor settings, living for health and rejuvenation and real estate commerce opportunities, even while discrimination and restrictive real estate covenants during the era prevented them from buying property in many areas and using various public and private facilities. Bruce's Beach in the city of Manhattan Beach, the Bay Street Beach, called by some the Inkwell, these are the places that I'm going to speak about today, and other places became contested ground in the development of attractive beaches and resorts free from white citizens' harassment. In Los Angeles, leisure presented a distinctive political concern in the nation's long freedom rights struggle and civil rights movement. The ability to choose leisure and how it would be spent have come to be understood as essential matters of social and political meaning and self-determination. As Mark Foster asserts, the lives of those African Americans able to defy the odds of relentless oppression to become successful citizens during the Jim Crow era and assert control to define themselves and claim community as more than laboring deserve historical attention. Their aims and achievements exemplify the diversity of the African American story in the migration patterns, socioeconomic status, cultural practices, and social power, and the making of American Western history, which needs to be more fully included in the collective public discourse to give a more complex understanding of the American experience. In Manhattan Beach, the recovery and struggle to, I have to say hi to my cousin. In Manhattan Beach, the recovery and struggle to present the fuller Bruce's Beach story for the public shows the difficult steps towards a more complex, accurate, and multiple meaningful public memory, which hopefully encourages the formation of a more inclusive sense of a collective identity. When Manhattan Beach was founded as the Bruce Resort opened and the city of Santa Monica was expanding, thousands of people, white and Black, from varied backgrounds migrated to the Los Angeles region in the early 20th century decades for economic opportunities, the climate, health, the beauty of the locale, and freedom. Many came with money to invest in homes and maybe other real estate and small business ventures. Some became wealthy from real estate transactions. At the South Santa Monica Bay coastline, Manhattan Beach was one of the last cities to begin development in 1902, with its name not decided until it was chartered in 1912. Public transportation systems enabled the beginnings of the city's development, and in this period, people from Los Angeles and Pasadena could take the electric streetcar and arrive in little more than an hour at the oceanfront retreat. Most of the area's growth occurred after World War II, with the aircraft industry springing up and population growth in the Los Angeles environs and freeways, making the coastal cities desirable and accessible for commuters. In 2013, Manhattan Beach's population was just under 36,000. In the barren sand dunes of yesteryear the barren sand dunes of yesteryear have evolved into a prosperous, overwhelmingly white enclave with a prestigious address where aging baby boomers build wood and mortar dream homes on the sand. In 1912, Mrs. Willa A. Bruce purchased the first of two contiguous Manhattan Beach lots near the Pacific Ocean shoreline between 26th and 27th, west of Highland Avenue, for $1,225 from a white Los Angeles real estate broker. She paid a high price for her 32 by 100 foot lot. It was underdeveloped, and in comparison to the cost of the nearby similar lots as well. Evidence indicates the land purchased by Mrs. Bruce contained no racially restrictive covenants. The more common practice of discrimination at the time appeared to have been the less legalistic but just as socially exclusionary custom of realtors refusing to sell land to African Americans in the beach town's more developed section. About 600 people lived in the small, half-resort, half-residential rural area, which became a city a few months after the June 1912 opening of the Bruce Resort. The U.S. federal census records show that Willa Bruce and her husband, Charles, and their son, Harvey, moved to Los Angeles sometime between 1900 and 1910 from Albuquerque, New Mexico. The family owned their own homes free and clear in both cities. Charles was a cook or a chef with a railroad company. Though there's no profession was listed for Willa Bruce, she may have earned an income using her domestic art skills and managing rooms from paying guests in the family's residence. Mrs. Bruce's skills were the prominent ones engaging the Afro-Angelino beach pleasure seekers at the new resort. Its opening amenities were described by the Los Angeles Times as a small portable cottage with a stand in front where soda pop and lunches were sold, and 2 dressing tents with shower baths and a supply of 50 bathing suits. In 1913, the earliest building was constructed at the place first known as Bruce's Lodge. By 1923, she owned 2 lots containing 3 structures, including a 2-story building with room for dancing upstairs, a cafe downstairs. Her Pacific Coastline resort business accommodated the enjoyment needs of African American day trippers and overnight guests. Within a day of the small resort's opening, some white property owners took action with the invocation of public power to harass and contest the leisure of the Bruce's patrons, as illustrated in the Los Angeles Times, Monday, June 27th, 1912, in this article headline that said, "Colored People's Resort Meets with Opposition." Written after a Sunday full of visitors at the Bruce's Beach Resort, the article noted landowner and city founder George H. Peck staked off and installed no trespassing signs on his acreage between the Bruce's property and the oceanfront. Simultaneously, 2 deputy constables patrolled the prohibited strip, warning Bruce resort patrons not to cross Peck's land to reach the ocean. The Times reported the small inconvenience did not deter the African-American bathers from walking the half-mile around Peck's land and spending the day swimming and jumping in the breakers. Mrs. Bruce became somewhat of a cause célèbre as well as an irritant to the local white supremacists. The pioneering Mrs. Bruce declared to the Times she was prepared to fight to keep her property and her business. White Manhattan Beach property owners publicly declared to the Times they deplored the state of affairs of the new resort and its clientele and vowed to find a remedy if the Negroes tried to stay. Until its forced closure in the mid-1920s, the Bruce's Resort was a popular year-round seaside gathering place, along with being a financially successful enterprise for its owner. It drew Afro-Angelenos to one of the few places locally where they could enjoy the Pacific Coastline's offerings with minimal harassment. Anchoring a growing community related to the Bruce's claiming the place through commerce and residency, by 1926, several African-American families had purchased lots and built cottages nearby Bruce's Lodge. They most likely had been introduced to the Southern California seaside living possibilities on previous visits to the isolated Bruce's Beach Resort. By the early 1920s, some concerned and increasingly vocal white citizens believed a Negro invasion was in progress, which would have an adverse effect on their property values. Legal sanctions and private actions using public power as a harassment tactic from new city ordinances and other, including aggressive threats from the Ku Klux Klan, were implemented to discourage African Americans from visiting, walking up and down the shoreline, and settling in Manhattan Beach. During this time, the African American-owned California Eagle newspaper reminded their readers in reports about the matter, California civil rights laws made it illegal to discriminate against all citizens in public places, such as the oceanfront. When the white supremacist harassment tactics did not succeed, a proposal to condemn the Manhattan Beach northern neighborhood through eminent domain to create a park was submitted to private citizens, by private citizens to the city council and was eventually passed in 1924. After challenges to these proceedings were unsuccessful, the evicted Bruce's Beach community property owners settled for the most favorable sale price they could obtain. Whether they were adequately compensated for their land has remained open to debate into the 21st century. During this period, the Eagle encouraged readers, if African Americans demanded their rights, they might settle the question of swimming pool and public beach access sooner than later. Taking up this question, individual agents, along with members of the Los Angeles branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People challenged a ploy by Manhattan Beach officials used to make the beach white only when they leased the beach area taken by the condemnation land grab to a private individual for $1 a year. The leaseholder proceeded to exclude African Americans from the public beach area. After the NAACP staged a wade-in and legal maneuvers, the Manhattan Beach officials revoked the private lease. In its first organized action of civil disobedience, the Los Angeles NAACP branch won the fight to prevent civil rights law circumvention and African Americans' exclusion from swimming at Manhattan Beach's oceanfront. In the coming decades, this accomplishment contributed to racial restriction attempts at public beaches fading away. The Afro-Angelinos were energized by this victory as the NAACP's national office proclaimed in a press release this militant stance for civil rights in Southern California set a good example and a good backdrop for their 19th convention that would be held in Los Angeles in 1928. As the 20th century advanced, individual agents and local, state, and nationally organized groups such as the NAACP would increasingly utilize legal actions and public protests to disseminate, to dismantle legally sanctioned, along with informally enforced segregation and discrimination in public accommodation. With the land seized and its occupants removed, the next 30 years of idleness erased the history of the vitality of the place once called Bruce's Beach and the African-American presence in the city of Manhattan Beach. Eventually, in 1956, out of fear of legal consequences of the past inaction by local officials, the vacant sandy sloping terrain was transformed into a park of 5 terraces that would, over the years, be called several different names. Since the 1970s, local knowledge about the city's racist legacy had given some of the civic policing members a peaked discomfort and feelings of shame or embarrassment, with some wanting the legacy's erasure from public discourse. In this period, Manhattan Beach public histories and local newspaper accounts discussing the site used guilt-ridden, evocative terms such as bloat on the city's generally progressive record, and park has an embarrassing history. Some local citizens grappled with their municipality's heritage, past and contemporary identities, and collective consciousness. After a few years of sometimes contentious public meetings in the early 21st century, in 2007, the site officially known as Bruce's Beach, the site unofficially known as Bruce's Beach was formally commemorated with a park name in its honor and descriptive signage 80 years after the Black community, the Black resort community was removed. The site's conflicted heritage has continued to hold an equally contentious place in the social memory and collective consciousness of the Manhattan Beach polity, and I would say in California in general, the same is true of our greater body of citizens. In the final Bruce's Beach signage text, the historical understanding of the site evolved into a political contest to absolve contemporary white citizens' guilt about the 1920s land grab and racial discriminatory events which occurred. Intended or unintended consequences of the new signage text language placed primacy on a competing interpretive voice. The white Manhattan Beach founder, George Peck, is featured in the text's first line as the dominant political and social narrative in the story of why Bruce's Beach is commemorated. Contrary to what some Manhattan Beach residents have passed down through oral history, there is no evidence that Peck was an ally of the Bruce's Beach community. There is evidence he supported the bigotry of his fellow citizens, white supremacist acts of economic and social injustice done to the hardworking, tax-paying African-American pioneers. The sign text omits mention of the 1920s nonviolent civil rights agents and struggle, which forced local officials to discontinue discriminatory land leasing policies inhibiting African Americans from Manhattan Beach's public shoreline. These and other problems with the signage text reinterpret the historical meaning of the past to subvert the public intent of the Bruce's Beach Heritage Commemoration as a place where pioneering African Americans took agency to participate in the fruits of California state's recreational and commerce offerings and demanded justice and equality. Unfortunately, popular memory of historical events and agents in this situation proved difficult to extract or add new information to, even with new scholarship, advocacy, and more enlightened historical and cultural civic leadership. Naming the park site Bruce's Beach does gain public commemorative recognition and acknowledgement. Broader claims for public memory and American identity are opened up, even with the signage text that dilutes, misrepresents, and partially omits the site's historical truth and understanding. Whereas in Manhattan Beach, African Americans were unable to build a sustainable community, they were able to establish residency in the Pacific Shoreline area with the founding of the city of Santa Monica in the 1880s, a few blocks from the beach in the environs of what is today Santa Monica's Civic Center and Phillips Chapel, the first African-American church that was established in the city over 100 years ago. Other African-American families began their new lives a short way south in the neighborhood of Venice. They were also part of this Santa Monica community. Phillips Chapel was the first spiritual outpost established by the Christian Methodist Episcopal denomination on the Pacific Slope. Santa Monica is the only seaside community in the region with an African-American community featuring a historical institutional space as old as Phillips Chapel. In 2005, as a result of my research and my activism, the Landmarks Commission and the City Council recognized Phillips Chapel as a City of Santa Monica landmark due to its cultural significance. In the years of Phillips Chapel beginning in 1908, the oceanfront area down the hill around Pico, south a few blocks to Bicknell Street, emerged as a gathering place where African-American groups from Santa Monica and all over Los Angeles County came to enjoy the beach, sun, and surf. While the boundaries of the beach leisure site shifted through time, it was a popular beach for African Americans from the early 1900s to the 1960s. Many of these beachgoers once referred to this stretch of coastline as the Bay Street Beach. Other people called it the Inkwell. The latter term was most certainly derogatory and first used by whites, referring to the skin color of those who used the beach. Some reclaimed the term and used it as a badge of pride. Although it is how the beach has come to be known, there are some people who went to the beach and never used the term. And in contemporary times, there are still people who would prefer the term not be used. Phillips Chapel and the families and extended clans of the Lawsons, the McCarrolls, the Brunsons, the Reeses, the Tabors, the Gordons, the Maxwells, and others formed the Santa Monica community that played an important role in drawing African Americans from across the Southland region and beyond for leisure at this beach. Here, at this site, they could enjoy themselves without facing racially motivated harassment that occurred at many other Southland beaches. As was the case with African American leisure spaces near U.S. eastern and southern cities with relatively large Black populations that sprouted up in the early 20th century, the beach race-specific leisure space of Southern California grew because there were entrepreneurs and residents in the area who offered services and accommodations to African American visitors. Accessible by streetcar, the beach was near a thriving African American community centered around Phillips Chapel at 4th and Bay Streets and a few African American businesses that were eventually established. The beach was a gathering place with a bathhouse, cafes and restaurants, tennis courts, volleyball nets, and other recreational opportunities. It became a place of refuge and a site of community formation. In 1922, a group of African American investors led by prominent attorney Charles Darden and Norman O. Houston, who would go on to become a founder of the Golden State Mutual Life Insurance Company and other businesses, sought to develop a first-class beach resort along the beach at Pico Boulevard. The plan was met with protests, and the white Santa Monica City officials blocked the development from happening. After the Black investment group abandoned its plans, the property was purchased by white developers. Their plans for the resort were dropped. The white developers' plans for a resort were approved, and now Casa del Mar, and at that time, the iconic Casa del Mar Club, now hotel, was built, and then another beach club within a year, the Edgewater, was also built. Even with this and other new development, African Americans kept their hold on the public beach space, although they were pushed further south. African Americans were able to avoid overtly physical hostile discrimination at the area as the area evolved from the edge to the center of public activity. While racial discrimination, in particular racially restrictive covenants, prevented African Americans from buying property throughout the urban region, their community's presence and agency sustained their oceanfront usage in Santa Monica. African Americans pioneered leisure in America's frontier of leisure through their attempts to create social, communal, and business projects in conjunction with their growing population in Southern California during the nation's Jim Crow era. With leisure's reimagining into the center of the American dream, they made Californian and American history by challenging racial and class structures when they occupied public recreational spaces at the core of the state's formative mid-20th century identity. These leisure spaces marked an African American identity on the regional landscape and social space. Through struggle over these spaces, African Americans helped define the practice and meaning of leisure for the region and the nation, confronted the emergent power politics of leisure space, and set the stage for these sites as places for remembrance of invention and public context. In 2005, the 2005 landmark designation of Phillips Chapel set the stage for the city of Santa Monica in 2008 to officially recognize with a landmark monument at Bay Street and Oceanfront Walk the historical African American beach gathering place, sometimes referred to as the Inkwell, and Nick Gabaldon, the first documented surfer of African American and Mexican descent in the Santa Monica Bay. Gabaldon began surfing in the Pacific Ocean at the Bay Street Beach and eventually became a skilled recreational waterman. His legacy has inspired many to consider him a role model, and especially surfers of color. The Bay Street Beach was locally recognized for cultural and social history significance rather than architectural or natural aesthetics significance. At leisure and recreation spaces, systematized white racism in ethnically diverse Los Angeles was most consistently targeted at African Americans. Yet they proved this racism of the region more readily contestable than elsewhere in the United States. From working class roots, Nick Gabaldon participated in the sport of surfing at a time when bigotry and prejudice were not far away on land or in the ocean. From his courage and dedication have empowered many to pursue their passion of surfing and other human experiences. His and other African Americans' actions embody the local stories that contribute to the national narrative of mass movement to open leisure space to all, demonstrating how the struggle for leisure and public space, along with political and economic issues, reshaped the long civil rights movement. This kind of designation, which infuses a cultural and natural resource site with complexities of human history and experience, strengthens both the heritage and nature conservation movements by giving them critical dimensions beyond beauty, rarity, and environmental protection. From an environmental justice standpoint, the inclusion of this history is symbolic of limited social change and pushes forth a sense of shared cultural belonging and common membership in American society that helps informing a basis for social progress and action in the future. As a public historian, I have led coordination to facilitate remembrance of African American voices at Santa Monica Bay historic sites through the development of innovative programming partnerships between the Santa Monica Conservancy, Heal the Bay, the Black Surfers Collective, Surf Academy, the Los Angeles County Supervisors, California Historical Society, and other groups. With outreach, in particular, to underrepresented communities, the multiple media and public programming actively connects a diverse public to more complex, culturally inclusive stories of our collective national history, social action, beach access issues, watershed stewardship intersecting with beach recreation. In the last 10 years, newly available research, landmark designations, documentary films, art pieces, and public programming developed in the reclamation and recognition of African Americans' participation in the California Dream and Santa Monica beach culture space are the foundation of the organizational collaborations that are engaging audiences for education and social action. In 2012, Santa Monica's Bay Street Historic African American Beach Site began as an International Coastal Cleanup Day location. Volunteers of all ages are taking part in community service tasks to help clean up the beach as they learn about watershed stewardship, sea life, and the site's social history. Since 2013, Nick Gabaldon Day has commemorated the memories of Gabaldon, who I told you was the first documented surfer of African American and Mexican descent, alongside numerous others who enjoyed the Bay Street Beach during the Jim Crow era. The beach celebration provides outreach to foster historical studies, along with ocean stewardship intersecting with the joys of surfing, while promoting engagement of broader audiences in the ideals of heritage and nature conservation and the environmental justice movement. Inclusion of Nick Gabaldon and Coastal Cleanup Days, inclusive of Nick Gabaldon Day and Coastal Cleanup Day activities, the Passport to Success LA Life's a Beach series field trip pilot program has emerged, and it's now in its second year of bringing South Los Angeles youngsters to visit the Santa Monica environment. Led by the Santa Monica Conservancy and myself acting as the coordinator, these trips capitalize on the partnerships built in the other activities to expand the innovative programming to include visits to the Santa Monica Conservancy's offices in a historic shotgun house, the 19th century Rancho era Pascual Marquez family cemetery, and the recently landmarked Malibu History District at Malibu Historic District at Surfrider Beach, and the Pier Aquarium, along with Santa Monica's Bay Street Beach. Visits to all these sites expand the youngsters' learning about local history, heritage conservation, watershed stewardship, and civic engagement while intersecting with beach recreation. The field trips also offer youngsters a view to future career prospects. Additionally, we are helping them to build personal experiences with culture, historical, and nature, heritage, and civic engagement that are the foundation to stewardship and the development of the next generation of civically involved citizens. The benefits of ongoing investment in the pluralistic heritage and nature education through partnerships is important to continuing to build future pathways to new, wider, and younger audiences and established audiences in the heritage and nature conservation movements to connect all with new experiences and more culturally inclusive stories of our collective national heritage and our concern for our environment. Strategies may vary, but both the heritage and nature conservation movements focus on the need to keep the unique and irreplaceable pieces of our heritage intact for all people to experience. The nature conservation movement's engagement of broader and more culturally inclusive audiences is enhanced by developing the cultural and historical heritage of natural sites, such as the ones I've discussed today, to reach specific audiences and align with community values. Both movements must acknowledge that issues of race, diversity, and social justice are intertwined with heritage matters. Inclusion of language of injustice, discrimination, inequality, and racism in natural, cultural, and historic heritage discussions acknowledges the continuing struggle to totally dismantle these conditions, which in more places than some may want to recognize, continue inhibiting communities of color from full participation and human experiences and civic social entitlements. The identification of the Jim Crow era historical African American beach sites in the Santa Monica Bay region of Bruce's Beach and the Bay Street Beach through park renaming and a local landmark, along with the field trips, Nick Gabaldon Day, the Coastal Cleanup Day site, open the door towards environmental justice by recognizing that communities of color have a right to historical and cultural sites along with clean air and water and enjoyment of America's natural resources. These public process activities for education, stewardship action, remembrance of our collective history, and cultural identity offer new ways to connect people with nature, culture, and historical heritage. Thanks. Okay, if anybody has any questions, comments, thoughts they want to share?
I'm going to see if any of the people on the webinar might have questions too. But if you're in the room and have a question.
I'll start. Thank you so much.
And tell me your name, please.
My name's Joan, and I manage our Southwest region, so I'm really familiar with the LA beach area, but not the particular stories that you told about Bruce's Beach and Inkwell. I just wanted to say, because staff might not be aware, that through our Explore the Coast program, we actually do help fund the Nick Gabaldon Day festivities.
Yes.
Which is just really cool. That's the thing we've just gotten to be aware of in the past couple of years.
Yes, I'm aware of that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So then just a couple of personal things. You talked about the restrictive covenants, and I will never forget when my father died in the mid-90s, and I found the deed to our house.
Where?
In Campbell, outside of San Jose. My parents had bought the land and built the house in 1947, and there was a restricted covenant in the deed to the house. And when I read that language, it was so painful to read something so mean and inhuman as to say Asians, Mexicans, African Americans, or blacks cannot buy property in this subdivision.
Mm-hmm.
And by then, of course, the mid-90s, that was illegal through the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Well, actually, it was illegal not through that, but through the case Shelley versus Kramer, and then another case, and that was in 48.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
So anyway, just a couple of experiences.
Mm-hmm. That's a lot of people. That's wonderful that you remember that, because a lot of people haven't had that opportunity to look at the deeds and see, and they didn't remove them because they were on too many. It was just, they just invalidated them. Mm-hmm.
My name is Lori Posner. I'm with Environmental Traveling Companion.
Can you talk a little louder?
I'm
And
Lori
maybe stand
Posner,
up.
and I'm with Environmental Traveling Companion. Thanks for being here. We're a guaranteed conservancy. You're a grateful one. And my question is whether from your work you find that these histories of discrimination and exclusionary policies and practices are an extension of other kinds of economic and socially exclusionary policies, or are they unique to this area of recreation and leisure related to African American gatherings, experiencing leisure, and enjoying the benefits that you described?
Well, I think it's both. In terms of, the laws, we did in California have civil rights laws, as I mentioned. I didn't say what year they were implemented in the 1890s, that said public accommodations were open to everyone even during the Jim Crow era, but those laws weren't necessarily enforced. And you have to remember that Jim Crow and discrimination was going on all over the country, and all of that was social, political, involved in housing, involved in employment. It was pervasive. So I don't know. It came from everywhere. In terms of contemporary times, if that's what you're asking, the reason why there's still issues with beach access for community of color, is because, for instance, with Bruce's Beach, they chased the people out of there in the 1920s. And so therefore, when you chase the people out and then you're not going to allow them to buy land in that locale, then you're not going to have a community that develops there. And there are a few families that were not exactly in the tract of land that they took through eminent domain that still own some property there, and I know at least one of those families, but generally the people that have been moving to Manhattan Beach have moved there in later time, and they're very affluent African Americans, and it's a whole different kind of community for the African American community that might have evolved living there. In Santa Monica, it's a little different because you have a historic African American community there with people whose families were there at the turn of the century, and they have continued living there either in some of the property that the families bought early in the century, or they've moved around to different places, and then you have the new community that has moved there. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, pretty much. My question related to whether you see this as having unique dimensions related to this issue of gathering spaces in the public, recreation and refuge, those elements. There's unique response and aggression for that. I
said that in my presentation in terms of African Americans during the Jim Crow era, and you could argue in some cases that that's still pervasive today. When you look at the situation with the police brutality that's going on in various places, public gatherings of people of color are sometimes viewed as a threat, even when they aren't. It's just because people are doing something different. Well, not even different, but yeah. She had her hand up first over here.
Yeah, and then maybe after Emily, then maybe a couple of the online ones.
Hi, I'm Emily. I'm interning with the Conservancy. And I had a question about Nick Templeton's death. He died at 24, which is really young. And I was wondering if you knew that it was racially driven or was really a...
He died in a surfing accident.
Okay.
He was trying to do a stunt, and he died. he was trying to shoot the piers, in Malibu. And he died, and it was big waves that day, which is, I was gonna say it's unusual for Malibu, I won't say that, but it was a strong wave. Those waves up there are really kind of, they're long because of the way the breaks are. I'm getting too complicated.
There's several surfers in the audience, so they probably appreciate it.
Yeah.
But, yeah, Rich Walkley.
Yeah, so surfing accident.
Surfing accident.
Are historical racial patterns of beach use still reflected today, and who uses what beaches in and around LA?
Yes, I would say that in certain cases they are, because the African-American community is situated in certain pockets where they have more access to the beach, so you go where you can get there more easily. But it's not the same as it was in the Jim Crow era, but it's more about convenience to use.
Yeah, and John Christensen has some data on beach use in Southern California, broken down by race and ethnicity for different beaches, which is very interesting. And then, is there a map to share to identify the sites if you want to take a visit? Do you know of any?
Well, I mean, the beaches, the two that I talked about today, Bruce's Beach is between 26th and 27th off Highland in Manhattan Beach. I think you could find that. And then the other beach is at Bay Street, which is just south where the marker is. It's just south of Pico, right by the Casa del Mar. You can't miss that. It's a hotel now.
Yeah. Bruce's Beach shows up on Google Maps.
Yeah, the Inkwell does too.
And then Alex Westoff asked about sea level rise planning and whether any vulnerability assessments for these sites have taken into account their cultural significance.
I'm sure that in terms of, I haven't been studying that, but the Bay Street Beach in Santa Monica it's a manufactured beach. It was through Beach Restoration Project, the beach that's there now. If you saw that map that I put up there earlier, there was a much smaller beach. So it's already been impacted by sea level rise with the expansion of the beach through the restoration project. So I'm sure that there's some consideration of the beach. I don't know at this point whether there's some consideration in terms of how the environmental groups are studying it. And that's something for me to look into.
Yeah, maybe LA County Beaches and Harbors, they've been doing a sea level rise study of LA beaches.
Yeah, that's something for me to look into.
Yeah.
And in terms of Manhattan Beach, I doubt that if it's LA County, maybe.
Maybe we could take some more questions from the audience, and I'll read these and figure them out.
This gentleman.
Just a quick question and comment. One is that we commissioned, the comment is we commissioned a study on beach uses. And one of the interesting comments that I saw in that study was people saying, when asked what were impediments to their using a beach area, was they're seeing people of their ethnicity at the beach in order to feel safe and comfortable at that beach, which is just an amazing response. It's like really, seeing, feeling like at home in a place is so critical. People enjoying the beach,
Well, it's feeling at home, but also feeling like they're safe.
Yeah.
That
was the comment.
Yeah, feeling like they're safe, because there are times, I grew up in Southern California, and I can't say that myself, I felt threatened in certain areas, but I can say that I remember going to the beach in Manhattan Beach when I was in high school, and I was like, oh, this is the first time I've ever been to this beach, and there's no black people down here. Now, that was then. I wasn't afraid, but it was just something that I thought about.
Right.
And then when I was a child, we went to the beach at sunset. And I don't know that I was in elementary school, I mean, I'm just giving personal anecdotes. I don't know that I ever really thought about it in that way because I was with my mother. And my mother liked that beach because she could park, there was a bathroom, there was a lifeguard, and when the little restaurant was open, we could buy food there. And so she liked it, you know, for that. And I don't even, at that time, I don't even think I remembered thinking about race. So.
Just one other quick question, I'll be brief, is that when you think about civil rights movement, a lot of it is centered around education, integration of education and transportation. Did your study look at whether the surrounding schools were being integrated at the same time, and whether that had any influence?
When you say surrounding schools, what are you talking about?
Like I saw on one of the maps, there was a school nearby, so I wondered if that.
Well,
Santa Monica, you mean?
Yeah.
Or Manhattan?
Actually, it was Manhattan Beach. So whether you can correlate integration.
There's no integration of schools in Manhattan Beach.
They were never
segregated.
Right.
There weren't any black people, or, you know, there was one or two black people that may have been there in school during the Jim Crow era. There's one or two Asians or Mexican American people that would have been in school during the Jim Crow era. Recently, there was a firebomb at a black family's home. He's a pharmacist and she's a lawyer. So, ongoing. This is just 3 years ago, like within the last 3 years. And then in terms of the 60s, there were fire bombs and cross burnings even in the 60s, and they had issues with whites not, 60s and 70s, not renting to African Americans. So there are some African Americans. This family has 3 children that I'm talking about that were in the high school at the time. One of them now is at Stanford. The other one is like a senior this year, and the other one is like a 10th grader. So did I answer your question?
Well, in a way you did.
Yeah, okay.
I think, did you have a
Oh,
question?
yeah, my name is Laura Rodriguez with Youth Outside, and I first of all want to thank you so much for all of your amazing work and for inviting us to be in this space with you. I just wanted to really appreciate your bringing up in your presentation and really as a whole what this is doing, which is to really create a different narrative and to share a greater part of the whole truth, right? When the narrative so predominantly is, oh, people of color don't do this, people of color don't do that, oh, we don't go here, oh, they don't go there. Yeah, why? Right? Why have it?
Or they did go and people just ignored them.
Right, and you know, or you go and you don't feel safe, you don't feel welcome, you don't feel all of the things, right? And so I just really want to appreciate what your work is doing and celebrate it and really applaud it.
And maybe just, have you studied, researched similar areas along the California coast, such as Northern California or the Bay Area?
You know, we've been trying to ascertain how myself and a few people who are here in Oakland, how that manifested itself. It was a little different up here because people could go to the beach pretty much anywhere, because that's not I mean, people go to the beach here, but they don't go to the beach here because it's cold. You know, I mean, the people that are going out to the beach out on the other side, I forget what that beach is out there in San Francisco. Yeah, I've been out there, but it's cold out there. You don't want to be out there, you know, regularly kind of hanging out. So
You got 3 weeks in the year.
Right, right.
About now.
Now, right.
Next month. Yeah.
And today would be a good day. Yeah, today is a good day. And then the beaches in Santa Cruz, people would go down there. There was a space down there that people would go to, but I haven't been able to get a good handle on that. And that tells me, and this is from some longtime residents, and that tells me that because I can't get a good handle on this, there wasn't the problem of beach access. People may have been harassed, on an individual level or in a group if they went someplace, but it wasn't like it was consistent.
And probably wasn't documented.
And it probably wasn't documented as well. Yeah.
Although the Cedro Bath had a lawsuit that was related
Well, that,
to California.
yes, that's true. But that question's asking about beaches, and I forgot about the baths, right? And that was a swimming pool, because they wouldn't let people of color in there, yeah.
And then, Jack Leibster, he's with Marin County, but he used to work for the Coastal Commission. I think this is just a statement similar to some of what you said. It didn't stop with Jim Crow. Back in the 80s, the Coastal Commission conditioned a development at the Jonathan Club on the club opening its membership to blacks and other minorities.
Oh, yeah, there was a lot of discrimination that went on with the pride. Well, for instance, with all those clubs that were built, African Americans, Jews, for that matter, were not allowed, and Mexican Americans, because it would have been Mexican Americans when those clubs were built, were not allowed to use those clubs. Now, they might have a few black employees or a few Mexican American employees, but they weren't allowed to become members of those places. And that's carried even into contemporary times.
Any other questions here, or?
I was just going to say, I used to teach at UC Santa Cruz, and there's a couple of churches in Santa Cruz that look just like sort of like the church we were talking about in Venice. And in the 40s, there was a large African American population in Santa Cruz that was connected with the Coast Guard, from my understanding. And now there's still in Seaside, which is closer to farther south, closer to Monterey, there's large African Americans that were connected with Fort Ord. But I haven't heard anything about whether there was access or not. It'd be interesting to look into that. Yeah.
Yes, but I mean, that's one of the reasons why, in terms of the beach stuff, when I'm saying people went to Santa Cruz, that I don't think that there was, a segregation thing, because there weren't enough people, and there was the community that was there. And it was later, yeah.
The other thing is, in Martha's Vineyard, there's a beach called Inkwell,
right,
which sort of probably has for similar reasons.
Right, and there's one in North Carolina, and there's another one someplace else. It was not an uncommon name, we'll say that. A lot of beaches were African Americans or waterways, because it could have been on a river. People referred to them as the Inkwell because black people went there.
And that was a white thing put on the black community?
Yes, and then the black community in some cases took it as a badge of pride, remade that.
And your research, today you talked about Bruce's Beach and the beach in Santa Monica, but you're looking at leisure space throughout Los Angeles.
So this particular, I have this project evolved over 10 years. It started out with my master's studies where I was looking at a leisure site at Lake Elsinore, which was a place where African Americans had a little community there that was a year-round community and a leisure community. And so then I learned about all these other sites, the two at the beach that we've talked about, a country club that African Americans bought in Corona in the 20s from white people, another site up at Val Verde, which is in North Los Angeles County, that African Americans went to and developed a community there, a planned community, and then they got some funding for a park. And so these sites were sites of leisure as well as contestation during this era of Jim Crow. And they were the stories of these places, as I said, about the beach areas, are the local stories that contribute to the national narrative about opening recreation for everyone, and to the stories of the freedom rights struggle and the long civil rights movement. So I've done these, for the book, which is coming out on University of Nebraska Press, I've looked at these sites and their particulars in terms of how they, their history, their memory, and they each developed differently. Some were kind of organic, some were planned, and some exist today and some don't exist.
Did you get oral history?
I got a few oral histories. Some of the information that I got in particular about Lake Elsinore, it was a lot of oral history. And it's a lot of, in terms of all of the work, most of the photographs that I have collected have come from private collections.
When is the book coming out?
So, right now, we're in, I finished the PhD in 2015. I got the book deal pretty much immediately, and it's an academic press. And so we're in the final stage of a second peer review. So I'm hoping to find out immediately. We've been waiting, okay? So we're hoping to get the book out by December 2019. If not, it will be in the beginning of 2020.
I have another question, just clicked with me. There has been a critique of the city of LA and maybe LA generally that there aren't very many public spaces, that the way the city was developed with a lot of suburban homes, everybody had their own backyard, there wasn't so much demand for public parks and stuff, and LA is really kind of park poor. So just kind of an interesting aspect of what you're talking about, where the beaches really are the big public space. And I just wonder how the experience of public use of the beaches is similar or in any way different than public use of any civic plazas or any other, public gathering areas in terms of like discrimination or cultural uses.
So actually, initially, in terms of Los Angeles and Southern California, the beaches were seen as the playground of the region. And so, in addition to, and that's in conjunction with this notion of building backyards and what have you, and why we wound up being park poor. But they always thought that the beach was the playground. And when the city was smaller, and you could get there easily on the public transportation conveyances before the roads got in, and then even after the roads got in, yeah, it could be. As it relates to this question of public versus private plazas at this point in time, when you have your public spaces being privatized, so it's mostly shopping malls, really, that have these big street things. So that is discriminatory, because it's discriminatory to everybody, because they want you to come and buy, okay? And many of them, as public spaces, it's public walking space. They might have some seating area where they want you to buy food. So that's discriminatory to everyone. And it could be particularly discriminatory to people of color who want to go, and then the police are looking at them and thinking they're going to steal something just because they're different looking.
I have a question about the role of public transit, because I couldn't help noticing that there used to be the Pacific Electric Railway enabling people to easily get to the beach. Have you done any, looked at the role of transit on access to the beaches by communities of color now in terms of lack of access?
So, well, everybody, for the most part, has a car. Okay, so that's why I was saying earlier that there's some places where people go more because it's easier for them to get to from where they live. So there's a beach area that is near the airport that became an area that a lot of people of color, African Americans as well as people of Latinx descent, like to go to, because it's easy to get to from where most people live. So it's the 105 freeway now, but it was Imperial Highway, so those neighborhoods are post-World War II into the 50s, 60s developing, and then, now that we have the Expo line, it's like a whole new world in terms of people coming down to the beach, and it's really interesting because, you know, me as a, scholar, I am in a lot of different environments, and sometimes people say things to me that I don't think that they realize what they're saying, but they're making a comment about the people who are coming and their demographic makeup, and that they're like surprised and that they're not so appreciative of the diversity of people that are coming. But they don't think of it in the way that I'm sharing it with you. They're just like, there's just too many people. But they make these comments that talk about that in terms of the demographics.
Right.
So more people are going to the beach, okay? And I know that, I'll just say, this is anecdotal, from just walking up and down the beach, between the pier and to Venice. In the last few years, I've seen like just kind of, I feel like a change in terms of there's more people of color that I'm seeing out there of all ethnicities.
And so I'm from LA, and when I was in high school and it's related to transportation, there was going to be the Expo line to Venice. It was actually going to be going through Santa Monica, but it was going to go through the really rich area in LA called Beverly Hills, and that was going to be a stop. But Beverly Hills paid them not to stop there and rerouted the line down to Venice.
So that's not actually what happened.
Well,
Okay, so they're building that line right now.
they are.
Yes. So that line is going down Wilshire, and they were able to stop it at that point in conjunction with some methane gas issues. Okay, the Expo line was always going down Expo. The issue that they had was when it got over to around Overhill, I forget what that neighborhood is called. The people didn't want it to come through there, and that's a really ritzy neighborhood, but they lost.
Oh, they lost it.
Yeah.
Just a couple of things. I think the transportation issue is really an important one. I'm thinking of,
Can you speak up a little bit?
Oh, sorry. When Robert Moses dominated transportation in New York and was developing Jones Beach, he explicitly designed the overpasses to prevent buses. And of course, he didn't want people who rode buses, i.e. minorities, to go to Jones Beach. So there are ways to sort of integrate segregation into your transportation decisions and other decisions. And I just want to thank you so much for kind of reintroducing this history and bringing it back to life. My mother and grandmother lived in Los Angeles. My mom grew up there. She was very progressive, outspoken opponent of the.
What neighborhood?
Well, they lived in South Central LA.
Where?
125th.
Okay, well that's.
Or I think it was.
125th is the county, but still.
Oh,
yeah.
I may have that wrong.
Okay.
But it was a long time ago.
Right.
And also outspoken proponents of coastal access for all of their life, even pre-coastal access. But I've never heard the story. And I think that says a lot about how far we have to go. And I just really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I was just going to say that one of the things that happened both in LA and here is right after World War II, the oil companies bought up a lot of the streetcar rights because they wanted people to have cars and use gasoline. I mean, it's really true. That there was a key line that went from Richmond to Oakland, which was and across the Bay Bridge, and all that was bought up, and the tracks were sort of interesting. And so it's interesting that sort of the BART became a kind of response to that much later. And so, as well as the new line in LA. I mean, the fact the line's in LA is really a miracle, I think.
It is a miracle.
And BART predominantly serving the affluent suburbs.
Right. Well, we have some major transportation issues because of the fact that we have these electronic rail systems, which they're great, but really in terms of the way contemporary development, and when I say contemporary development, I'm talking post-World War II development with the car suburb, we have somehow discouraged people from using buses. And that's a shame, because if we could have more buses, then we could impact the issues that we're having with transportation and the car. Because we made it so that we have these far out neighborhoods, you can't build rail to all the places that people live now. And so we're going to have to work on our public transportation policies to engage more of our public in using the bus. You know, because I hear people all the time, oh, I can't go someplace because I have to ride the bus. The rail line doesn't go there. I'm like, get on the bus. You know.
The other ironic thing is a lot of the cause of gentrification is the kids of the families who move to suburbs realize they want to live in the city. That's actually, there's also a demographic. So it is interesting that sometimes, well, that has both bad and good consequences in terms of people wanting to be closer to where you work, for the very reason that, you know, the rail line should not have been taken away.
Yeah, and then displacing
Exactly.
the existing communities. Well, I really want to thank you again, and just, you know, your knowledge of history, of true stories. I mean, just like in today's, in the nation today, it just feels like, you know, we make stuff up left and right, and I really appreciate the the knowledge of, like, and the sharing of truth and of factual information and of stories that have many of us have not heard. So really appreciate that you came up and presented to us today, and I wish your book was coming out even sooner.
I do too.
That's a long way away.
Yeah.
Pre-order. Yeah, pre-order.
Right. I'll make sure to send the pre-order form.
Yeah. Yeah, and we got to find ways to continue, you know, between the Coastal Commission and the Coastal Conservancy, making sure these stories are part of what we are celebrating and sharing. So thank you. And thanks everybody who joined on the webinar. I think I'm hanging up now.